Hello. Welcome to this evening's TI Technology webinar hosted by Texas Instruments. For tonight, we're going to take a look at some strategies you can use to implement TI-Nspire Technology on the first day of school. I see that many of you are joining us for the first time, so we'd like to offer a special welcome if this is your first T-Cubed Professional Development webinar. We'd also like to thank everyone for completing the live survey on the right side of your screen. My name is Mike Houston, and I'm the moderator for this event. I teach algebra and calculus near Pittsburgh, where I use TI technology to make tough-to-teach, tough-to-learn concepts accessible to all my students. I'm really excited to introduce our two panelists tonight, Parisa Shirazi and Betty Gasky. Parisa has a passion for teaching mathematics, especially for helping teachers integrate technology in the classroom. After attending her first T-Cube conference, Parisa was inspired by the creativity and ingenuity of the presenters and enthusiastically worked to become a T-Cubed regional instructor in 2013. She has enjoyed being a TI Math Forward coach for the past 4 years. And during that time, Parisa has had the privilege of working with amazing educators from all over the nation. Thanks for being with us, Parisa.
Thanks for having me, Mike. It's great to be here.
And Betty taught mathematics in grades 7 through 12 and at the university level for 28 years. She is a T-Cubed contract instructor and has served on numerous Texas Instruments professional development writing teams. Betty enjoys working with math and science teachers to help them more effectively incorporate technology in their classrooms. She has conducted trainings for teachers in the United States and Asia, with a recent focus on TI-Nspire Technology and the TI-Nspire Navigator system. Thanks for joining us, Betty.
Thank you, Mike. Great to be here with everyone tonight.
We're expecting a large crowd, so your audio is muted. Feel free to send any questions to all panelists using the right side of your screen. We'll also send general messages in the chat window. Once we move to the teacher software, that right section of your screen will be replaced with a green floating toolbar. You can access the Q&A window by clicking the question icon. This session is being recorded, and as a reminder, we'll provide a link to the event certificate of attendance at the conclusion of the webinar. Once that recording is available, if you'd like to follow along with your handheld or your software, and we really hope you will, we do recommend doing this with the recording. That way you can download the activities and pause and rewind the recording as necessary. We don't expect to have any audio issues tonight, but in the event that you do, try selecting Communicate in the WebEx menu, choose Audio Broadcast, and then click Join. At this point, Parisa is going to discuss our agenda.
Hi, everyone. So now that we've gone through the introduction, what we're going to share with you tonight is about introducing TI-Nspire Technology to your students. We're going to offer some suggestions for doing so. We're also going to share some basic introduction to a couple of the Nspire applications like graphs, lists, and spreadsheets, data and statistics, and calculator applications. And then we're also going to share some of the free online resources available to you as well.
Thanks, Parisa. And Betty is going to discuss our expected outcomes.
Thank you, Mike. And tonight we will explore some basic skills with TI-Nspire Technology. As Parisa suggested, we would look at calculations, graphing, and also graphing and describing data, as well as the graphing of functions. And so you'll learn techniques to use the TI-Nspire Teacher Software in your classroom and how to enhance your curriculum with those free standard line activities that you'll see at Math Nspired. And we also have activities available at Science Nspired as well.
Thanks, Betty. It's all yours.
All right. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Mike. So we're going to get you started, and Betty's going to actually be controlling the computer for us. She's going to start us off in the teacher software. A little bit later in the webinar, we're going to talk about some classroom management tips and norms, but we wanted to help you become familiar with the layout of the handheld. And of course, you can use this as a suggestion for getting your students familiar with the layout on day one as well. So for some people, the layout might seem overwhelming at first glance, but if we break it up into 3 sections, it can make things a little bit easier to swallow or a little bit more clear. So as I'm going to go through the 3 sections there, we're going to open up a question to you guys if you'd like to respond in this chat window about which of these buttons reminds you of the keys that are found on the keyboard. So you can go ahead and respond in there as I take you through this basic layout. If we start from the bottom of the handheld up, we're looking first at the alphabet keyboard, which is that bottom section. And a lot of you might notice that this is not a QWERTY keyboard. The reasons for that is so that this device would be allowed on testing. This might be a little bit difficult for some people to get familiar with at first, but of course it's just in alphabetical order. If we move to the middle section, that's going to be basically our numeric section of the keyboard. And if you were to cover up the left side of that numeric section, you'll notice that it's very similar to your normal graphing calculator that you're used to using. That left-hand side will just show some of those higher functions and higher calculations that are available. Now, if we go up to the top level of the keyboard, that top section, that's going to be our navigation keys. And hopefully you'll see that some of these might be familiar to you. We have a tab button, we have escape. One of the things that takes a little bit of getting used to is just that middle section, which is the navigation pad or nav pad. And this is very similar to like a mouse or a trackpad on a laptop. The most important thing to know about that section is that the center button is similar to a left click on your mouse. So let's take a look at the chat window and see if anybody had any ideas for how any of the buttons that might be familiar to you in terms of, do any of those remind you of a computer keyboard?
Teresa, can you do me a favor and just restate the question one more time?
Of course. So now that we've looked at the basic layout of the calculator, of the handheld, one thing that you might want to ask your students that we're posing the question to you is, do any of these buttons remind you of a computer keyboard? And I'm seeing some responses.
Excuse me, yes, lots of responses coming in now.
Excellent, perfect. The escape button and the tab button are ones that are really handy for people to notice, because if there's ever a dialog box or a window open, the escape button will be nice to just get you right out of there. And some people who aren't as comfortable using the trackpad will use that will use that tab button to navigate from one option to the next. Excellent. Thank you guys for those responses. Perfect. Somebody pointed out space and return, like space, like return and enter. Perfect.
And if some of them show up that you're not familiar with, we'll certainly look at many of these as we go through the evening.
Great. And Mark pointed out right click. So those of you that were not familiar, control menu, once more control menu will be like your right click on a mouse that you're used to. So I'm glad to see that a lot of people are familiar with a lot of those keys, so hopefully it's not so overwhelming and it's not so much new to get used to by switching over to this handheld. So now that we got those responses from you, that is going to actually go ahead and press the home key for us. And notice when Betty presses the home key on the emulator, that's highlighted in red. So that's going to show you exactly what she's pressing. The only thing that's going to be hard for you to tell what Betty's pressing as she goes through this tonight is if she presses like the left click, or which would be the center key, the center of that mouse or nav pad. That's the only time it'll be hard for you to tell when she's clicking that. But Betty's going to take us to the home key because I'm going to ask her to take us to My Documents. And My Documents is going to look different for all of you on your handheld or your own software, but one thing we wanted to point out is a file that comes standard on every single handheld and every software is in this examples folder. So if Betty chooses that examples folder, there's a file called Getting Started. And one reason people might like to use this or might like to have their students go through this document is because it's very similar to like a tutorial that they can move through at their own pace. It gets them familiar with the buttons and navigating through some of the documents. Perfect. Thank you, Betty.
All right. Thank you, Parisa. And we'll come back and visit more related to introduction of the handheld to the students and classroom norms as we go through the webinar tonight. One of the first things we're going to look at related to the different applications on the TI Nspire, and I'll just go back to the home key and start a new document by pressing the key for that. As Parisa mentioned, Tab and Escape are very useful, but Tab will move you around from region to region, and then I can either select the number 1 or press Enter or even press Click to select the new document. And these are the applications that are available for the TI Nspire. For science folks, notice we have the Veneer Data Quest app, but of course we'll do a lot of data analysis using the lists and spreadsheets and data and statistics as well. But tonight we're going to start out by adding a graphs page. And notice that this is page 1.1 of this particular document, and we'll talk a little bit more about that numbering later. Parisa and I talked, and we wanted to be sure that you had an opportunity to see this template menu, which is this kind of funny-looking key to the right of the number 9 key. And the TI Nspire provides a lot of templates to be used. And often teachers use these with their students on a calculator application page, but they can certainly be used in other pages as well. So if I select the first one, for example, we have a fraction template. Some of you may know that that one lives in another location on the handheld as well. And I can either press Tab to move from cell to cell or the down arrow key. And so if we're going to graph a very simple function to start with, for example, f of x is equal to 2/3 x plus 1, the graphing is completed by pressing Enter on the keypad. And you'll notice that we have a function graphed and its label, and these are color-coded, because if you had 7 or 8 functions graphed on one page, it would certainly be helpful for the students to see how the colors are. But one of the most wonderful things to me about TI Nspire is this feature that I'm about to show you. If I moved onto the graph in the lower left corner of the screen or in the upper right corner of the screen, you'll see these arrows. Students very quickly pick up on the fact that these are rotational arrows. Now on the handheld, I would hold down the click key for about 2 seconds or press Control-Click in order to grab the line. On the teacher software, if you're demonstrating this or having a student demonstrate it, you will hold down the left click of the mouse and keep that held down as you move the graph of the function. Now immediately we can see that students would notice that the function is updating. Function equation is updating as the graph of the function is moving. And if I press Escape or release the left click, it stays in the position in which it was left. But now I can move towards the center of the graph page and see a different type of symbol. Again, on the software, holding down the left click of the mouse, I can move that graph and see the function update. Sometimes you might have a very long equation function that moves off the screen a little bit, so the label may be used as well. And I'd like you to pause for just a moment and send us some information in the chat window about ways that you could possibly use this particular feature and some course that you might be teaching this fall. So either one of these, how might that be used to help teach different concepts that you're going to teach to your students this fall? Give you a few minutes to respond to that. All right, linear transformations, slope. Getting some good information coming in here. Helping students understand slope and what changes in the equation if the slope of the y-intercept changes. Great. So this is one of the most interesting to me and interactive ways to start out with students if you're teaching linear functions. And of course we often have to review them in other courses, not just in math but science as well. So great responses there on connecting slope, y-intercept to the equation and its representation graphically. Thanks for those responses. Now I'm going to go to the menu. Oh, yes. Okay, trying to rotate the line. If you get on this and if you're using the handheld, hold down the click key for about 2 seconds and you'll see that it can then be rotated by swiping gently on the touchpad. So if that doesn't work, let us know and we'll try it again. Now one feature that teachers often want to see, because we're always talking about multiple representations, is looking at a table of values. So if you'll notice when we press menu, there's some menu options available, and this is specific to this graph page, and one of those is table. Now I could just simply press the number 7, but with students I tend to move to the number 7 itself. It slows me down a little bit and they can see exactly where we're going. And one option here is a split screen table, but notice there's a shortcut, Control followed by the letter T. We'll look at that in a moment. So if I choose split screen table, notice that we have a table of values and the function label is also color-coded with the graph itself as well as the function. So you can arrow up or down in the table, and as you'll notice right now we're going by a delta value of 1, but if you choose to change that, I could press the menu key, and please notice that the menu is very different on the table side than it was on the graph side. And one of the things that we can do with the table is to change the table settings. That's the 5th option. Notice also to remove the table, Control T will work. And students really like this. They think it's like a light bulb. Control T takes the table away. Control T brings the table back. So the light switch, turning the bulb on and off. So that's a nice feature. Now we often want to graph a second function, of course, and it may not be completely obvious how to do that. There are several different methods. If you talk with someone who's been using Nspire for a while, they'll show you their favorite method. But when in doubt, go to the menu and notice graph entry is available. Now, if I choose to graph another function, that's the first option. But notice there are many, many other things that we can graph with TI Nspire. We'll come back and look at the equation in just a few minutes. So if I choose function, it opens up a second function entry. For this one, I'm just going to select x squared, subtract 5, and again followed by enter. Notice again that we have a different color graph. The label matches. I'm going to move the label over to the side just because of something that's coming up in a few minutes. And the wonderful thing about this is that we can dilate our quadratic, and students clearly see what happens to the coefficient of x squared. We can flip it on around so the coefficient of x squared is negative, of course. And it's almost as if they can do discovery learning and write us notes about these concepts rather than just taking notes as we traditionally did. Also, near the vertex of the parabola, we can grab and translate, and please notice that we're in vertex form. And many of you who've probably taught these concepts for years know how students struggle with the x minus or the x plus in the vertex form of a parabola and understanding what happens in different quadrants. So this is a wonderful investigation for them to understand that concept. When we're looking at two functions, another thing that we often want to do, and again, looking at some of the basics that teachers always want to share with their students during the course of the first semester typically, is looking at points of intersection. Now this could be done with 2 lines, but since we have a linear function and a quadratic function, we'll just use these right now. If I go to menu and want to think about points of intersection, with the younger students, we may first want to trace on the graph to help them understand what a point of intersection actually is in this context. And if I choose graph trace, I can easily trace on one function, but a nice feature here is to trace on both functions simultaneously. And notice that it's color-coded again for function 1. At x is 0, I have a y value of 1.03. And for the second function, it displays that value as well. The open circle lets me know where I am as far as independent variable value, and the closed circles on either function give the function value indication as an ordered pair. So this is a nice investigation for students to try to estimate points of intersection, but making sure that they understand that if the x is the same and the y is different, that it is not really a point of intersection. Another nice feature of tracing with the TI Nspire is that sometimes we might want to change the trace step, and that's very easy to do. It's the third option here under the trace menu. So if we don't want to trace by 3/10, for example, if that's preset for this particular window, we could change it to trace by 1/10 or some other value that would be helpful. I'm pressing escape, as Parisa mentioned earlier, to get out of menu options. But I'm also going to press escape because this indicates to me that I'm still in the tracing mode. And also, one other thing we did want to mention to you is for the older students, some people might choose to let them use technology to check their answers after they have solved the system of equations in whatever manner you would like them to solve. So we can always go to menu. Geometry tools are available in the coordinate plane, and one of them is points and lines. And in the points and lines menu, we do have intersection points. If I select that, I can move to one graph, select it, move to another graph, select that graph. And if you'll notice in the upper left-hand corner of the screen, this is called a tech tip. When you select something from the menu, it will give you information on what you should do to use that particular menu option, which is very helpful for the students, particularly when they're in geometry and constructing triangles and reflecting them across lines and that type of thing and not sure what to do. So the choice I made there was menu, geometry, and points and lines, and under points and lines, intersection point. So we went into points and lines first and then chose intersection points. Now, one nice thing here is if I dilate the quadratic or move the linear function around, these intersection points will update as well. So this is a very dynamic environment. Everything updates. Now, there are lots and lots of things we can do with this, and I did just want to share a couple more. If I were teaching science, for example, I might want to graph 2 exponential functions. So I'm going to do control followed by document, which has plus page above it to add a page. And if I go to graphs again, notice that this is F3 now because we're in the same problem, it's called. Problem 1, page 1, problem 1, page 2. So if I wanted to graph an exponential function, for example, using the caret, and enter, and then we can go to either our menu and choose another graph entry. Students quickly find that the tab key will open the entry line again. And then perhaps I would graph something like 3 to the x power. And then students could either trace or display a table and compare that exponential growth for those different bases, doubling or tripling. So lots of nice applications in math and science. I'm going to add one more page now, control followed by document. Notice the plus page above it. There are other ways to add a page, but that's one way that students often use because they can see the plus page. If I add a calculator page right now, one thing to be aware of, since we have a function called F1, If you wanted to evaluate some function values, you could simply type F1. Notice it became bold because there's a variable stored for that. So perhaps I want to evaluate F1 at 10. That will take the linear function that we had on a previous page, and to move back a page, we can click. So for F1 of X there, I can see that it's been evaluated. For those of you who teach a little bit higher level courses, sometimes you might want to do compositions of functions, so you could type F2 of F1 of some value, for example. And so it will do those types of evaluations as well. And for science folks, if you choose to store values for variables, for example, storing negative 9.8 meters per second squared, the gravitational force, control variable could store that, and then enter. And then even if you were on another page, that value could be used. So if I move back a page to a graph page, notice again that tab will open up the entry line. I could actually type the letter G. It becomes bold. We would have to use the multiplication key. So even though this is not an appropriate equation in the science context, you see that that can be used, and it will not be rotated this time because G is a stored value, negative 9.8. So the one thing you do have to be careful about here is you have to use the multiplication symbol because TI Nspire allows you to use more than one letter. Sometimes for fun, I ask students to pick their favorite number and to store their favorite number to their name. And this is something we can actually do with TI Nspire that would be difficult with other platforms. And then I ask them to go to the variable key and simply pick the variable that is their name and see how they look squared, and so on. So letting them know that they can store numbers to words. And sometimes the middle school teachers use this. You might store 5 as the number of apples and this type of thing. So I actually, when I was using the F2 and F1, I think a question came through, I just simply typed the F key from the keypad, and if a function has been stored to that, it becomes bold, and you can evaluate. So these are some of the favorite things that we do with functions, but be aware that on the calculator page, there's lots and lots of concept development that can be done. We don't want to just simply use it for calculations. Sometimes teachers will simply store a number and then multiply it by another number and continue to press enter and let students look at exponential growth in a numerical aspect. And then some math teachers who struggle with students trying to divide by 0, they might go back and use the template. And notice how the template stretches out when I keep typing numbers. And then if I type something in the denominator that clearly should not be there, the students will see that it is undefined. So lots of interesting things that we can do with the calculator application. And just one other quick one is that there is a way to test truth values using numbers. And control followed by the equal key gives you your inequalities. So for example, students often get confused a little bit about negative numbers. So they could do some testing there about -1 less than or equal to -2, for example. So again, a quick whirl around the geometry application and rather the graphs application and some of the things that we can do on the calculator page. But I encourage you to think about letting your students use this to look at patterns and those types of things that are fun for them to do. Someone did mention modeling, and we will get back and look at some graphing of real data and do some linear modeling with that in just a few minutes. Okay, Marisa, I think I'll turn this back to you unless there are questions we should address right now.
There was one question that popped up, Betty, and I made a note to the participant that if we had time we could try and answer it at the end, that when you were showing the intersection points using the geometry tool, if there's a way to have those displayed as fractional values instead of decimal format. And I had said that I use System Solver on the calculator page if I'm looking for those types of solutions, but I don't know if there's a way
not to my knowledge, and I'm sure Mike will chime in if he knows, because this is actually not necessarily 4 and 1100ths. It's just displaying that number of digits, and often we can hover over the screen and over a number and press the plus key repeatedly, and we'll see that there actually are more digits there. It's just simply been rounded for space, so there may not be an exact fractional value that would be displayed. So if there is a way, I'm not aware of how to do that.
Okay, thank you.
And since you did mention intersection, those of you who are familiar with the Analyze Graphs tools from some other handhelds, possibly, all of those tools are still here. I just chose to use the geometry option to display tonight.
Okay, wonderful.
Thanks
so
a lot.
Thank you for that question, and thank you for handling that answer. Betty's going to take us back over to education.ti.com, and we're going to look at some other ways of using your handheld to support your instruction and help build that conceptual understanding with your students. If anybody missed the website exactly how I stated it, Betty reminded me today that the website is listed on the back of every single handheld. Right towards the bottom, it says education.ti.com, if you're having a hard time remembering that. She's going to take us to the activities menu, which is going to be towards the top of the screen. We want you guys to notice that there is a Science Inspired section there. We're going to actually go to the Math Nspired section and choose some activities, but of course for the science teachers that are joining us tonight, you could search for activities through the Science Inspired menu as well.
And the two new sections, relatively new, on STEM Behind Hollywood, some folks may have seen, but also this STEM Behind Health is fairly new as well. So, and we encourage you to look at all of those when you have a chance.
Perfect, because we'll all have a wealth of resources, and the most exciting and most amazing part about all these resources is that they are 100% free. So everything that we show tonight, you could download for free. You could use them to present through your teacher software in front of your class, or also transfer to your class set of handhelds, which we're going to talk about a little bit. We're going to mention a little bit more about later. But Betty's going to take us to the activities menu. She took us to Math Nspired, and those of you who are familiar with the website, there's a little bit of a change to it now that makes it a little more seamless, a little easier to navigate. So she has the option of choosing a subject through that drop-down menu, or also on the left-hand side. She's going to take us to the Algebra 1 area of Math Nspired. And then we're going to look for an activity called Slope as Rate, which happens to be in the Linear Functions section. So she's going to scroll down and find the Slope as Rate activity. And notice that, Betty has not opened it yet. This animation sort of just gives you an introduction to the activity. This is actually a little bit outdated. They've updated this activity compared to the one that you see in the video here, and it will actually highlight the difference between slope when there's a vertical line versus horizontal, and that. But we're going to point out that this basically could help you with students understanding and seeing that graphical and algebraic representation. This is a great activity to do that. So if you notice on the right-hand side, Betty could choose to download the student document, the teacher notes that go with this, the TI-Nspire activity, of course, or she could do all of those at once. If you're curious as to which standards this aligns to or which textbook this aligns to, you have the option of searching that as well. So she isn't going to actually download this because she already has it opened in the software, but we're going to actually go to another activity now in the Algebra 2 section. And under the quadratic section of Algebra 2, we're going to download an activity or look at an activity called Modeling with Quadratic Functions. And this is going to just give you an idea of how we can make that connection with a real-world representation right on that one device, so the students can actually see this image. And what they can do that's so great with this activity is that they can, if Betty goes ahead and moves over to page 2.1, she can graph a function to try and model the pathway of that ball. So in this activity, the scale is actually given to the student, and the student handout asks them questions related to the scale. But if you were inserting this, if you were doing this on just a normal graphs page, that wouldn't necessarily be set for you. So this is going to give students an opportunity to discover the connection between that quadratic function and, of course, the graphical representation, what is needed in terms of the actual equation or the function in order to get it to match the pathway of that ball. So this happens to be an image on a graphs page, and because a lot of times we get that question of teachers wanting to know how to import images into documents, Betty's going to actually take you through that process right now.
And this will be a very quick process, because the neat thing about inserting images is it's not a difficult thing to do. I could either open up a new document, or I could just simply add a page to this document. But I think I'll just go ahead and do Home and go to New Document. And notice it's asking me, just as it would on the student handheld, if I want to save the unsaved document. So I will say no, that's not necessary. You could save it if you chose to. Now you can put images on quite a few different types of pages, but often, as you saw from the last activity, we do want to add a graphs page to import an image. And in the TI-Nspire Teacher Software, you have this Insert option. Notice that Insert would let me insert any of those types of pages, but I typically do it the way students would do on the handheld. But for inserting an image, we simply come down to Image. And it automatically, in your teacher software, goes to a folder called Images that has been loaded by the teacher software into your Documents folder, and then a subfolder called TI-Nspire CX. So again, this Images folder is preloaded with sample images, but any image you have on your computer will be fine. So I'm going to choose a fence one. And notice that this is a lovely coastal scene. And with the teacher software, I can move to an empty space on the screen. You can do this with a handheld as well. On the handheld, press Control-Click or hold down that click key. With the software, I'm just going to grab and move. So you could place the axis or axes anywhere you chose to. And then we could ask students questions or suggest that they model something in the picture. So right now, just in the chat for about a minute or so, if you would share some thoughts that you might think of when you would see a picture like this, what sort of things might you ask your students to do? It might depend on what you're teaching. And I've seen science teachers bring in lots of neat pictures that they have used to teach science concepts. This is a typical one used by math teachers. Someone just suggested Pythagorean theorem. Okay, moving the origin. If I'm on the software, I just simply move to an empty space on the graph screen. Hold down the left click of my mouse, keep it down, and I get what I call the desperate-looking hand that will actually drag it around. On the handheld, you would press Control followed by click, or hold down the click key, and you'd get that same desperate-looking hand, and you can drag the axes around anytime on a graph page. All right, so some folks are talking about points of intersection, equations to match the fence board, finding the equation of a line. Another neat one went by a minute ago that I saw. Translations. Oh, great idea. And someone else, when I showed this in with a group of teachers not too long ago, wanted to take one of these line segments and reflect it across where I have the y-axis placed. Oh, are the lines perpendicular? So as you can see, it's only limited by our imaginations, and students might think of something completely different. So it makes math teachers run around like crazy now, taking pictures so that they can use them in their TI-Nspires, and the science teachers as well, thinking of really interesting ways to use images in their science classes to teach concepts, or even to take a picture of a graph of a titration, for example, in science, and ask students to think about where the important points are in that process. All right, so that was a quick one, but we did want just to share. Again, I opened the graphs page and simply did insert image, and you can search in your computer for an image that you might have. So Parissa's going to talk with us a little bit more about classroom management, and then we'll come back and look at entering some real data in our handheld and graphing that data and analyzing it.
Perfect. Thank you, Betty. So a lot of us are not just wondering about how to get our students used to using Nspire as a graphing calculator, and of course using all the other applications, but just the whole classroom management, organization, and all those teacher things that we need to think about when setting up our classroom. So because we're handing over a very expensive device for our students to use each day, it's important for us to think about how we set that up for success. And in this picture, what you can see are some handhelds that are basically on a docking station. Some of them in the picture actually have wireless network adapters, but whether you were the person that unpacked your box of equipment or if somebody else did that for you, every box comes with this sheet of stickers, and it comes with some long stickers and some small ones that are square shaped. So some of you might not have been sure exactly what to do with those, but there's a long, that if you could just take your mouse and show down the vertical line down the side of that docking station there, that long strip is kind of what that long sheet of, that long strip of stickers would go down on the docking station. And then, of course, you could take the little square and you could place that on the top of the handheld, like it's done in the picture with number 11. Or if you had Navigator, you could place it on the top of the wireless network adapter. But, of course, these will come off very easily with time. So what some schools have done is they've actually printed their own labels and put those on the back. Or some schools actually will end up engraving them if they have those resources available. But the reason why this is so important to do is because if the student knows that you're keeping track of which device they have every day, instead of just, I'm going to go and grab whichever one's available, then of course if something were to unfortunately happen to it, then they know it's going to be easy for you to figure out who was maybe responsible for that damage that might have been done. And so what will end up happening, because we know middle schoolers are just so happy and willing to come tattle on each other every once in a while, is they'll come and show you immediately when class starts, hey, somebody wrote on this screen, or somebody did this, I wasn't responsible for it, in case you end up seeing that later. And so it can take a little bit of time in the beginning of the year, but really, truly, it's just a matter of numbering your roster and having that roster match what number calculator you're assigning to each student. It will make the management, the organization, just making sure that you have all of them accounted for each day so much easier. The other thing that I was going to recommend, some schools will actually end up sending home a parent letter, and this will just be to inform the parents of the type of equipment that their students are going to be using throughout the year, and having them sign it that they're aware of it, as well as the students sign it, will help this process, because the students will know I'm responsible for this, I'm acknowledging that I'm responsible for this type of equipment, and of course that I'm keeping track of that. So we just wanted to open up a question to you guys, because so many of you have probably come up with some wonderful ways of keeping track of this that if you might want to share with the group. So if you guys don't mind taking a second to just go ahead and offer some suggestions to each other of how you have handled the classroom management of your handhelds in your classroom. Even if we don't get a chance to read through all these, you could, of course, review or maybe print out the chat responses after the webinar and look through those examples. Yes, so each student pretty much assigned a calculator by number, and that will just really help make sure that you're aware of who's responsible for each device, and it's not just a random thing. If you were to find some damage to a screen or something later and we didn't know or we didn't have it numbered, it's hard to hold anybody accountable. And then, of course, you know, if they're not held accountable, then they might be willing to do more things than they had if you knew how to keep track, if you had kept track of those. So it seems like use a small label on the back, perfect, with room number, calculator number. Awesome. Somebody even mentioned, Jenny Kelly said, especially if you're at a campus where they collect them for testing, some schools will say, like, I have set A, calculator 1, set B, calculator 23. That way they all go back together and they all go back to the same room. But thank you guys for offering those suggestions. I see some that are coming in for people that have Navigator and what they've done to kind of manage those things. So Betty's going to actually go back now, and of course if you didn't get a chance to see everything, you can review those chat options after the webinar. Betty's going to take us through the list and spreadsheet application now.
Okay, thanks, Teresa. And again, it's not necessary to open a new document, but if we were starting something that we were going to send to the students through the docking stations or through Navigator, we would want to possibly do that. So I'm going to add a list and spreadsheet page, having opened a new document. And this is a wonderful feature of the TI Nspire. It will behave very much like you're accustomed to in Excel if you've not used this in TI Nspire before. But one thing that we need to do if we're going to graph data, which of course we're always interested in, we need to name our list. And I'm going to start with a list named time. And some of you may know a shortcut for an underscore, but I did want to share with you that control followed by this little open book is a symbols menu, and the underscore is there. We use that rather than parentheses if we want to give something else related to the list name. So time is in seconds. And I'm going to name the second list just very briefly DIST for distance, even though it could be typed out. And again, use the underscore. And the underscore is, again, either located here. Some students know the shortcut is control followed by the space key. And I'll use a distance in meters. And so this could just be some data that students collected. I'm going to type in a very small amount of data, and then we'll go back to Math Nspired in a minute, and Teresa will show us where some preloaded data sets are so that you can let students immediately go to the investigation part. Also, if you're using the Veneer Data Quest app, the students will be able to plug in a sensor and collect data and analyze that data. And it's a very powerful thing to do to let students collect their own data, of course. So again, just putting in some sample data. Perhaps they were walking and someone was recording their distance from the wall and they started 0.5 of a meter away. So one feature with TI Nspire, if you'd like to see the graph simultaneously with the data, which again is a wonderful multiple representation, I can go to menu. Notice this menu is different than our previous ones. It's appropriate for what we need for this type of page. Go to data. And one option is Quick Graph. Now you will notice, as students always notice, that I did not exactly get the graph I had anticipated. There is a way to highlight both of these lists and get a scatter plot immediately. But I like for students to see this so that they can say, well, should distance really be explanatory or the independent variable here? And if you click on that, you're able to change it to time. And the students like the dancing dots. And then go and click and add another variable, in this case, of course, distance. So in this case, they can see the data and the graph on the same page. And if they had made a mistake, they could change a data value. And notice how the dot will jump. I'll go back and put it back to the way it was, so all of it's connected again. Now, often teachers like to have a graph on a page that's a larger representation. So we can add a new page, control, document, and simply add a data and statistics page. And with the data and statistics page, we can graph the data, have a full page graph, and again, the labeling is done very nicely for us. and the students can clearly see what's happening here as far as the representation, and we would ask all those wonderful questions that we always do related to the trend of the data. One thing you have to warn the younger students about particularly is that this is not necessarily 0, 0 in the lower left-hand corner, but if you need to change the window settings, that is available. Now, typically, of course, we want to set a model to the data, and there are several options available. For the younger students, we could go to Analyze, add a movable line, and then rotate or translate just as we did on a graphs application page, which is a wonderful feature. And that movable line is a stored variable. So if I wish to choose to add a calculator page, I can add a calculator page, go into my variables, and notice my two list variables are there, but so is the movable line. And we could say, okay, if you're 20 seconds into this walk, for example, where will you be? About 7.7 meters away, if you continued at a similar pace, of course. So it gives us some very good tools for prediction. I'm going back a page, and let's talk about what we would do if we wanted to remove this. And for a little bit older students, we might wish to go back to Analyze, remove our movable line, and in this particular case, you may wish to do some sort of regression. And if we go to Analyze, right arrow, our regression tools that are available are these. If I'm in my science class and I'm going to do a linear, I might want to choose a plus bx, or in some statistics classes, starting position plus velocity times time in this case. Or if you did a linear one, both of those are available. Be aware, for those of you who are in states where you're going to be teaching residuals, we do have the wonderful option of looking at those very easily. And if I go to residuals rather than regression, we can show residual squares or the residual plot. So that's a nice investigation for students, and there's some neat activities you can do with that at TI Math Nspired. Now notice there seems to be a clear pattern to these residuals, which is a hint to me that perhaps I should select another model. So rather than removing the current model, I'm just going to add a new data and statistics page and do the time again and the distance. And I think many of you noticed, even though we went by it pretty quickly there, that this seems to be some sort of curvature to my residuals. And my residual gives me the difference between what was observed and the value predicted by the linear model. So since we've got some curvature, we might try another model, and in this case, perhaps quadratic, and see how well that fits. And again, if we would like to make predictions, control right arrow moves me forward a page. It's another option. I now have all of my variables stored from that quadratic regression. And if you come down the left-hand side and kind of look at the indicator here, this little baby looking f of x, that is my set regression equation. So if I make a prediction for 20 seconds with my regression equation, notice that it's a much lower value than what I got before, which seems rather strange considering the values I've got here. Oh, but it's moving back down again, of course, like a quadratic would. So we have to also talk to students, is it reasonable to make predictions that far out when our data is clearly not beyond 6 seconds? So a good hint to us and a hint to our students as well, because clearly the quadratic model would come right back down again. So there may be another model that's better in the context of the problem. Question about clearing a list. One way to do it is arrow up all the way up to the very top of the list. Go to Menu, always Data, and I always forget whether it's under Data or Actions. So, well, oh, if I highlight it, I can just hit Clear. Sorry about that. So I could highlight it, press Clear. And I think in an earlier operating system, there was actually another way to do it. and it still may be there. I just didn't choose the correct option. So that is one way to do it, to highlight up and use your delete key. So I just simply arrowed the whole way up. Once you get here to the name of the list, arrow one more time up, and it will be there. Okay, so we've just got a couple of minutes, and Marisa, you were going to take us to Math Nspired and looking at.
Perfect. Betty just pointed out or showed an activity if you were going to enter the data yourself, and we just wanted to point out back in Math Nspired, for instance, in the middle grade math activity, if you go to the statistics and probability section, there are tons of activities where the data has already been entered for you. So one of those that she's going to point out is lines of fit. And the reason why we wanted to highlight this one in particular, if you look on the right-hand side, notice this one comes with the normal student activity, teacher notes, the TI-Nspire activity, but most importantly, it also comes with an assessment. And that could be used to check for understanding as formative assessment throughout the lesson, or it could be used as a culmination of the activity as summative assessment to see did they really understand everything you were trying to accomplish throughout the investigation and working through that activity. So we pointed out some resources to use, like the Getting Started under the Examples menu. Of course, Betty took you through the graphing calculator, data and statistics and list and spreadsheet application. And then, of course, we're mentioning these resources on education.ti.com. Right now, she's going to one of the statistics activities. So if you teach a higher level like Algebra 1, Algebra 2, Pre-Calc, or even AP Stats, and you're looking for activities that align with your content, that entire statistics content area is going to be really helpful, and it has a ton of activities where the data has already been entered for you. And then one more time, she's just pointing out, since we have focused so much on math-inspired activities, that there are science-inspired activities available for all the different content areas as well. And those are available for Nspire, and I think they're also highlighting for iPad as well. And then, of course, there's so many there that use probes and for data collection.
Okay. Mike, I'm going to send it back to you now. And one thing we did not mention that Mike's going to mention is that there are lots of video tutorials available for all of these skills that we've gone through tonight. So let me get back to doing that. All right.
Thanks, Betty. So we are going to concluding tonight's webinar. And as Betty just mentioned, I do want to share a few things that are available on our website. Again, education.ti.com. And if you go into the Professional Development tab and slide down to Online Learning. There's some really great things that are going on this page. For one, we have live webinars. And we're really excited to announce, not only do we have another webinar next week, but we have our entire fall webinar series lined up, ready for you to register. So you can check out some of the things that we're going to be discussing this fall, like STEM behind health. I know it's mentioned tonight. But some other things that we don't typically, we haven't had a lot of webinars on in the past, like the basics of coding and authoring. So I'm really excited about some of the offerings we're going to have this coming fall. Please feel free to visit education.ti.com. Under that Professional Development tab, select Online Learning, and then feel free to register for any of our live upcoming webinars. Also, our on-demand webinars, so any of the webinars that we've had in the past, and there are hundreds at this point, have a new filtering system. So if you want to filter by technology or content, it's a lot easier to do that than in the past. Finally, on the right-hand side, we have technology tutorials. And our friends over at Atomic Learning have put together these really great short videos and tutorials for the TI-Nspire handheld. So especially if you're new, but even if you're not new and you just might be a little rusty from the summer, feel free to check out some of these really short videos that they created They're great. You can watch them as many times as you want, and they are free. To receive a certificate of attendance, go ahead and click that link in the chat window. That link contains the name of tonight's event. Also listed in the chat window is a link to the documents that were used tonight between Parisa and Betty. If you happen to miss those two links, fear not. In a couple of days, you'll automatically get a follow-up email that will have those two links included, as well as a link to the recording. Thank you so much, Parisa and Betty, for all of your engagement tonight. I really enjoyed a lot of the questions that you were asking, and some even better, some of the responses that we got from our participants tonight. So thank you so much for all your preparation.
Thank you all for joining us.
Yes, and thanks for all the wonderful interaction from the participants.
We hope to see you back online next week. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great night.